It was the summer of 1993, inside the packed Oakland Civic Auditorium, a humid night where the air shimmered under spotlights and every seat throbbed with anticipation for Stevie Wonder's long-awaited return to the West Coast. The crowd rose like a single wave as Stevie finished a powerful soul-lifting run, his final note hanging in the rafters like a living ember. But just as the applause roared to life, Stevie paused, head tilted, brow softened, as though hearing something beyond the cheering, something quiet and hidden beneath the noise. His hand lifted slightly, signaling the band to hold. The drums softened, the keys faded, and slowly the arena fell into a hush, charged with curiosity. What no one knew was that Stevie's attention had locked onto a small corner of the auditorium where a young choir boy named Marcus Hill, just 12 years old and trembling in his oversized church shirt, sat pressed between strangers, carried there by a dream he never dared to say aloud. Marcus wasn't like the other kids in the audience. He had come from the Jackson Street projects, a neighborhood stitched together with cracked sidewalks and broken windows, but also with mothers who prayed loudly and children who learned harmony before they learned hope. He had spent his life singing in a tiny community church where the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the old upright piano was always just a little out of tune. But inside those walls, Marcus's voice had been more than sound. It had been a refuge. Tonight, though, he wasn't singing. He was shrinking into his seat, knees knocking beneath him, terrified someone would hear the faint hum he made under his breath, a nervous habit he'd carried since he was small. He never imagined that humming, soft, hidden, unpolished, could travel far enough to reach the ears of a legend standing under blinding lights. But Stevie heard it, not with sight, not with chance, but with the instinct of someone who had lived his entire life feeling the world rather than seeing it. He lifted his head toward the upper midsection of the auditorium, a small smile forming as if he were picking a single thread out of a massive tapestry of sound. "Hold on," Stevie murmured, stepping away from his keyboard, his voice floating into the microphone with a calm, commanding warmth. The audience fell still. Every light seemed to dim around the edges as Stevie pointed upward, directly toward Marcus. "You up there?" The young brother humming. Marcus's heart stopped. People around him turned, eyes widening, whispers rising like sparks. Stevie extended his hand again, his smile gentle but sure. "Come on down, young man." In that instant, the night changed shape. Marcus Hill, who had never sung outside his church and never believed his voice belonged anywhere else, was being called into a moment that would alter the rhythm of his life forever. Marcus's legs refused to move at first, locked in place by a mixture of fear and disbelief that washed through him like a cold wave. The usher nearest his row leaned in, speaking softly. "He's talking to you, son. You're all right." But Marcus could barely breathe, his hands gripping the sides of his chair so tightly his knuckles blanched under the pressure. All his life, he had been told to stay small, stay quiet, stay out of trouble, advice that had shaped him into a boy who rarely looked adults in the eye and never imagined stepping into a spotlight meant for giants. But now, as the whispers swelled around him and dozens of people gestured for him to stand, something inside him nudged forward. It wasn't confidence, it wasn't courage, it was something more fragile, the sense that if he stayed seated, he might regret it for the rest of his life. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he pushed himself upright. The walk down the steps felt impossibly long, each stride shaking through him like a tremor. Marcus kept his eyes on the ground, not out of shame, but because he couldn't bear to see the thousands watching him descend into the glow of the stage. Every footstep echoed with memories. The cracked sidewalks outside his building, the choir director's gentle corrections, the late-night sirens he'd learned to tune out while practicing harmonies under his breath. Now those memories marched with him, a quiet choir supporting his steps as he approached the arena floor. The lights grew brighter with every row he passed, brushing against his skin like heat rising from a fire. He heard someone whisper, "He's just a kid," and another voice respond, "But Stevie chose him." Those words followed him like a fragile lifeline until he reached the security barrier where two guards gently ushered him toward the stage's glowing edge. When Marcus reached the final step, Stevie was already waiting, standing just to the side of the spotlight as though he didn't want to overwhelm him. Stevie extended his hand, steady and warm, his famous smile radiating reassurance. "Marcus, right?" Stevie asked, though no one had spoken the boy's name aloud. Marcus's lips parted in astonishment as he nodded, wondering how this man, this legend, could possibly know something so personal. Stevie squeezed his hand gently. "You've got a sound in you," he murmured. "I could hear it from up here." Marcus swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat as the arena fell into complete silence. As Stevie guided him onto the stage, the band lowered their instruments, exchanging stunned glances as though they sensed they were no longer part of a concert, but the beginning of a moment that would soon feel larger than music itself. The moment Marcus's shoes touched the center of the stage, the air shifted into a thick, trembling quiet that seemed to press in from every angle. He stood small beneath the massive wash of amber lights, his shoulders rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths as he tried to make sense of where he was. The vastness of the arena surrounded him like an ocean, thousands of silhouettes stretching into the darkness, all facing him, all waiting. Marcus felt the weight of their attention settle onto his narrow frame, and for a second fear clawed at his throat, threatening to choke whatever fragile courage had carried him this far. Stevie didn't move closer. He simply stayed near enough for Marcus to sense his presence, offering comfort without crowding him. "Take your time," Stevie murmured, his voice soft, steady, and full of quiet belief. Marcus's chest tightened. Someone believed in him, and that someone was Stevie Wonder. The band members, usually unshakable professionals, stood frozen behind their instruments, watching the boy with a mixture of curiosity and awe. The drummer rested his sticks across his lap, leaning forward as though afraid to even blink. The pianist let his hands hover inches above the keys, waiting for a cue he knew wouldn't come yet. Even the horns stayed still, pressed to their lips without a single breath blown through them. They all sensed it. This wasn't a performance. It was a moment suspended between fear and possibility, a test of whether a child who had only ever sung in a small, dimly lit church could lift his voice in a room big enough to swallow him whole. Marcus felt sweat prickling along his hairline. His hands twitched at his sides. His heart hammered so loudly he wondered if the microphones might pick it up. But then he remembered the choir director back home saying, "When you're scared, sing anyway." Those words flickered through him now, like a match sparked in darkness. Stevie stepped toward the microphone stand, wrapped his fingers around the mic, and lifted it with a reverence that made the audience lean in instinctively. He turned it around and extended it toward Marcus, slowly, carefully, as though offering him something holy. Marcus stared at the microphone, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't just a piece of equipment. It wasn't just a prop. It was an invitation, one he never imagined he was worthy of receiving. His fingers trembled as he reached out, hesitating a split second before finally closing his hand around the cold metal. The contact sent a jolt through him, a surge of fear and hope colliding inside his chest all at once. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply watched in breathless silence as Marcus lifted the microphone toward his lips, his eyes glistening under the lights. This was the moment where everything could shatter or everything could begin. Marcus stood motionless, the microphone hovering inches from his trembling lips as the silence in the arena grew dense enough to feel. His heartbeat pounded so violently he feared the mic might catch it, sending the sound of his fear echoing through every speaker. For a moment, he wondered if he should hand the microphone back, apologize, run off the stage, and return to the anonymity he understood. But then he felt Stevie's steady presence beside him, not touching, not guiding, simply standing there like a lighthouse for a boy lost in a storm. Stevie tilted his head, his smile soft and knowing, and whispered, "Don't worry about the crowd, Marcus. Just sing like you do at home." The words hit Marcus with the force of memory. His little church, the peeling paint, the wooden pews filled with neighbors who had nothing but their voices, and suddenly the arena didn't feel as terrifying. It felt like a chance. He closed his eyes, blocking out the blinding lights and the sea of silhouettes that stretched before him. Darkness wasn't new to Marcus. It was familiar, safe, a place where he could be himself without judgment or fear. He inhaled deeply, letting the air fill his chest, letting the silence wrap around him like the quiet moments before a prayer. As the breath settled inside him, something shifted. His shoulders lowered a fraction, his grip on the microphone steadied, and his lips parted just enough to release a small, trembling sound. The note was thin at first, fragile and quivering like a thread pulling free from a tightly knotted spool, but it was real, it was honest, it was his. The arena leaned forward in a collective inhale as the sound drifted out, weaving through the silence like a hesitant confession that somehow grew stronger the further it traveled. The second note came easier, fuller, warmer, carried by a breath that rose from someplace deeper than fear, someplace closer to the quiet strength Marcus didn't even realize he possessed. The tone stretched into the rafters, brushing against the heightened stillness, and the crowd began to stir with disbelief. People whispered, hands lifted to mouths, tears forming in eyes that had expected nothing more than a shy mumble, and behind Marcus, the band members froze in shock. The drummer's stick slipped slightly between his fingers. The pianist's mouth fell open. The horn section exchanged stunned glances, each musician recognizing exactly what was happening. This boy wasn't just singing. He was revealing something raw, something sacred, something that had lived inside him all along, hidden beneath years of fear and silence. And as the final note of his opening phrase faded into the air, the arena remained utterly still, caught somewhere between surprise and awe, waiting for whatever was about to come next. The silence that followed Marcus's opening phrase felt impossibly heavy, as though the entire arena had forgotten how to breathe. But Marcus didn't notice the thousands of eyes fixed on him. He still had his own eyes closed, holding on to the darkness that made him feel safe enough to continue. He drew in another breath, deeper this time, steadier, the kind that filled his ribs with something close to courage. When he opened his mouth, again, the sound that emerged was no longer a trembling whisper. It was fuller, richer, shaped by the quiet fire that had lived inside him for years. The note rose like smoke from a candle, soft but resilient, curling upward toward the rafters with a purity that struck straight through the stillness. Gasps rippled across the audience as his voice grew, layering strength over vulnerability until it became something unmistakably beautiful. This wasn't the voice of a boy from the projects. This was the voice of a soul that had been waiting its whole life to be heard. Stevie stepped back with a slow, reverent smile as the boy's sound filled the arena, refusing to overshadow him or interrupt the fragile miracle unfolding. His face shifted with emotion, nostalgia, pride, recognition, as though he were witnessing a younger version of himself stepping boldly into the world. Behind Marcus, the band remained frozen, every musician standing completely still. The drummer lowered, his hands to his sides, shaking his head in disbelief. The bassist whispered something no one could hear, eyes wide with the shock of hearing such raw talent erupt from someone so young and untrained. Even the backup singers pressed their palms to their hearts, swaying gently as Marcus's voice threaded through the room like a ribbon of light, weaving its way into the memory of every person present. For a moment, it felt less like a performance and more like a prayer rising from a place of longing and truth. Marcus lifted his chin slightly, still singing, letting the emotion crack through him as the final notes of his phrase surged with a power that even surprised him. His voice wavered once, not from fear, but from intensity, the sound vibrating through his chest and spilling into the vast space around him. When he finally let the last note fall into silence, it didn't fade quickly. It lingered, hovering in the air like a fragile promise refusing to break. The arena remained frozen, suspended in a sacred stillness so profound that even the lights seemed to dim in respect. Then, without warning, the stillness shattered. A single shout erupted from somewhere in the balcony, followed by a gasp from the front row, and then the entire auditorium exploded. People rising to their feet, hands flying to their mouths, voices breaking into cheers that shook the floor beneath them. The band stood stunned. Stevie closed his eyes, smiling with quiet pride. And Marcus Hill, who had come from the Jackson Street projects believing his voice didn't matter, now stood at the center of an ovation that proved he had been wrong his entire life. The eruption of applause slammed into Marcus like a wave he wasn't prepared to withstand. He stumbled back a half step, his free hand flying to his chest as if trying to hold something inside. His breath, his shock, his disbelief. The roar of the crowd rose higher, folding over itself in layers of cheers, sobs, whistles, and shouts of his name that people didn't even know yet. The boy blinked rapidly, stunned, his heart racing so wildly he felt dizzy under the heat of the stage lights. He had never seen an audience stand for anything he'd done, never even imagined it. And now thousands were on their feet, their faces glowing with awe, as though they'd just witnessed something holy. Marcus felt tears burning at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't dare move. He didn't want the moment to vanish, like a dream that collapses the second you open your eyes too wide. Stevie stepped beside him slowly, placing a steady, grounding hand on Marcus's back to keep him from collapsing under the tidal wave of emotion. His smile was soft and full of pride, the kind of smile a mentor reserves for a student who has just surprised the world. "Marcus," Stevie murmured, leaning close enough that only the boy could hear, "you brought the whole room to its knees." The words didn't feel real. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight, his shoulders trembling under the weight of what had just happened. He opened his mouth to speak, maybe to apologize, maybe to thank Stevie, maybe to say something he hadn't figured out yet. But no sound came out, only a shaky breath that shattered into a quiet sob. The crowd, sensing the emotional collapse happening inside him, only cheered louder, rising into a frenzy of encouragement that washed over him like sunlight through stained glass windows. Stevie raised Marcus's hand gently into the air, offering him to the crowd the way a pastor presents a blessing to a congregation. The applause roared higher, echoing off the walls, shaking the stage beneath their feet. People in the front row covered their mouths, tears spilling freely. Others reached out their hands as though trying to touch the moment itself. The band members had abandoned their instruments entirely, leaning against stands and wiping their eyes, overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. The sound was too much for Marcus to take in at once, so he closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. For the first time, he wasn't shrinking from attention. He was absorbing it, letting it fill the empty spaces inside him that had been carved out by years of self-doubt and silence. And above it all, Stevie whispered, "You belong here, Marcus. Don't ever forget that. As the applause slowly softened into a warm, pulsing hush, Marcus lowered his hand, still trembling, still breathless, his heart caught somewhere between disbelief and wonder. The arena didn't quiet out of indifference. It quieted out of reverence, as though no one wanted to break the sacredness of what had just happened. Marcus looked around, seeing nothing but a soft blur of lights and shapes, yet feeling everything with piercing clarity. The admiration, the pride, the love pouring from thousands of strangers who moments earlier didn't even know he existed. Stevie stepped closer, turning Marcus gently to face him, his expression glowing with the kind of sincerity that could steady even the most frightened soul. "What you gave them tonight," Stevie said softly, "wasn't just a note. It was truth." Those words settled into Marcus's chest like an anchor, grounding him in a way applause never could. Stevie then wrapped an arm around Marcus's shoulders, pulling him into a quiet, fatherly embrace that drew a collective sigh from the audience. The boy leaned into the touch, overwhelmed yet comforted, as if for the first time in his life he understood what it meant to be seen. Not for what he lacked, not for where he came from, but for what lived inside him. Behind them, the band moved with slow, reverent care, setting down their instruments as though afraid to disturb the emotions still hanging in the air. The drummer wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, the pianist covered his mouth with both hands, and the horn section stood, shoulder to shoulder, nodding in stunned admiration. Stevie lifted the microphone again, but instead of speaking into it, he placed it gently in Marcus's hands, a gesture that sent murmurs of awe rippling through every row of the auditorium. Marcus stared at the microphone, realizing it was no longer just a piece of metal. It was a symbol, a passing of trust, a passing of possibility, a passing of something bigger than the moment itself. Stevie stepped back half a pace, leaving Marcus alone in the soft circle of light as the crowd rose once more to their feet. This time, the ovation was different. It wasn't explosive, it wasn't frantic, it was warm, unified, and full of a deep, steady respect that wrapped itself around Marcus like a hug from the entire room. He lifted the microphone to his chest, pressing it there as tears finally spilled freely down his cheeks. Stevie watched with a proud, knowing smile. And in that moment, Marcus Hill, who had walked into the Oakland Civic Auditorium as a shy choir boy from the projects, stood tall as a young man who had made an entire arena fall silent with nothing but the truth of his voice. The night no longer belonged to Stevie Wonder. It belonged to Marcus.